In the summer of 1942, the tide was beginning to turn in the Pacific. US victories at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway had been damaging to the Japanese Imperial Navy. And on the 7th of August, Allied forces landed on the Solomon Islands of Guadalcanal, Tulagi and Florida to begin their first major land offensive against the Empire of Japan. What followed was a more than 6-month-long series of land, sea and air battles known as the Guadalcanal Campaign, and a critical Allied victory which pushed the Japanese into retreat and marked a key turning point in the Pacific theatre of World War II. I'm James Hanson. This is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Guadalcanal Campaign, but just how significant is it? And if Japan had claimed victory instead, how would the rest of the war have played out? That's a question for our experts, and joining me, as always, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And once again from the US, we're delighted to be joined by the historian and scholar Jonathan Parshall. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into the Guadalcanal Campaign itself, let's look at the wider context of the Pacific theatre in 1942. Obviously, this is just after the Battle of Midway, where, of course, the Americans were victorious. And you can see here we've got our big map of the Pacific theatre. The red area is the Japanese sphere of influence. You've got Japan here, you've got the Philippine Islands, you've got Papua New Guinea, and you've got the Solomon Islands, where Guadalcanal is itself just here. This is Australia. The Solomons about 1,200 miles or so off the coast of Australia, and crucially, you've got a key Allied shipping lane going all the way from Australia up to Hawaii, where, of course, you've got Pearl Harbor there as well. So, John Parshall, to begin with you, just provide a bit of wider context as to what's happening in the war in the summer of 1942.
Sure, absolutely. So what ends up happening immediately after the Battle of Midway is Admiral Ernest King, who's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy, wants to seize the initiative as quickly as possible. And literally within 3 days of the end of the Battle of Midway, he is already starting to send messages back and forth to Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii, talking about the next things that he wants to do. And they want to get carrier forces down into the South Pacific because they're convinced that the Japanese are going to continue to attack them along that perimeter down near that supply line that you just mentioned. And so fairly quickly, plans are thrown together to get a division of Marines onto Guadalcanal and recapture that area along with Tulagi, which is just to the north of it, because they find out that the Japanese are building an airfield at Guadalcanal. That's bad news for the Americans, because if the Japanese can complete that airfield, they're going to be able to push down the line of the Solomons and then begin threatening places like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, which are right astride that supply line. And the Americans are determined to preempt that. So as you mentioned, on August 7th, we land the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal. We capture that airfield, which is not quite completed yet. That's going to become Henderson Field in just a few days. We begin bringing aircraft in there relatively shortly afterwards. And as you say, that kicks off this 6-month campaign. In the course of that campaign, there are going to be 7 major naval battles. There are going to be 3 increasingly large land battles that are going to happen in August, September, and October. And there's going to be a constant drumbeat of air combat as the Japanese are flying aircraft down from Rabaul, which is at the tip of New Britain. That's their major base in the area. And they're going to be trying to put Henderson Field out of business using bombers coming down from Rabaul. So it really is a trifibious campaign involving air, sea, and land elements, and all of them are going to be in combat in the course of this 6 months.
And we'll come into the specifics of the Guadalcanal campaign in a moment, but Chris Parry, to bring you in, I suppose what is important to stress here is that, yes, OK, the Japanese have suffered a major setback at the Battle of Midway, but they are by no means out of this war or defeated. They're still pretty strong at this point.
Oh, they're very powerful, and you can see from the range of their operation, as John just pointed out, they're operating from Rabaul. Further back at Truk Lagoon, they've got a huge naval and air base. And what they're doing is they're building airfields on quite a lot of the islands within this catchment area here. Now, what's quite important in relation to what the Americans are trying to do, there are two things. There's one external, there's one internal issue going on. The external issue is they haven't done a major amphibious landing yet. So this will be the first major amphibious landing of the Second World War for the Americans. Now, they've got a base at Noumea down here in New Caledonia. They've also got Espiritu Santo, which is another base they can use. But they've only just got this 1st Marine Division of about 16,000 into theatre. They haven't actually done a practice landing yet or even worked together. Yep. So they're very inexperienced. Now, the internal issue is there is a tussle between Ernie King, the Chief of Naval Operations, the Commander-in-Chief, and Douglas MacArthur, who is in Australia. And Douglas MacArthur simply wants to go up through this island chain to capture the Philippines. Navy doesn't like that. The Navy wants to go through the middle, through the Carolines, to basically go right through the middle. It's part of what their Rainbow plan before the war. Admiral King, right from the start, has a very clear vision about what the Navy should do. And part of what he's trying to do here is get ahead of the game before MacArthur gets going. So there's a bit of competitive going on. What complicates it is that Guadalcanal is actually in MacArthur's sphere of command. Yes. So they actually have to shift the geography slightly to bring it into Nimitz's chain of command. And what brings Guadalcanal really to the surface as an urgent mission is the fact that the Japanese have invaded Papua New Guinea and are probing down. They've landed at Buna and are probing down through Papua New Guinea, and the Australians are holding them. They're doing really well to hold them, but there's a real knife fight going on there. And if they obviously take over Papua New Guinea, even Guadalcanal is going to become irrelevant because they've got the bases. What's significant is the distance between Rabaul and Guadalcanal is about 650 miles, which really stretches the Japanese air power if they're taking off from there. So at some stage, they might need to bring their carriers in. They've lost 4 at Midway, of course. So that's not a good look right now.
It's a really interesting point you raise about the relationship between King and MacArthur. And I want to pick up on that a bit later on because, you know, King plays the politics of this very cleverly because he really manages to get the Americans to adapt almost from a Germany first to kind of like a Germany first plus strategy, yes, which is crucial. Let's zoom in, though, and let's look at the Guadalcanal campaign itself in detail. OK, we've got a brand new map now. This is of Guadalcanal and some of the key islands around it. Just to give you a sense of the topography and point out a few key sites, obviously this is the pretty big, in the grand scheme of things, island of Guadalcanal itself. And Henderson Airfield is just here, which of course is absolutely crucial when we're talking about the Guadalcanal campaign. Got Savo Island here. This is the area of water known as Iron Bottom Sound. Then we move over here and we have Florida Island. And just off Florida Island, we have the crucial but tiny Tulagi Island, which is just there. So those are some of the key points that we're going to refer to quite a bit over the course of the next few minutes. John Parshall, I'm going to give you a bit of a challenge. It's an enormous campaign. This is over 6 months. But can you sum up the events of the Guadalcanal campaign for us in 5, 6, 7 minutes or so?
Yeah, it is a bit of a challenge because it does go on a fairly long time. We land our division on August the 7th. Almost immediately, 2 nights after that, there's going to be a naval battle called the Battle of Savo Island. The Japanese send a cruiser force down to try and disrupt our landing operations, and they absolutely shellac the Allied force that is in Iron Bottom Sound. They sink 4 cruisers and then head back for the exits. They could have gone after the transport anchorage, but did not do so for some complex reasons I won't get into. And that is, in my opinion, one of the most crucial moments of the battle counterfactually. So we should talk about that later. There is a ground battle that happens at a place called Alligators Creek about 2 weeks later, which is a victory for the Americans. There are then a series of sort of back and forth actions. The interesting thing about the Guadalcanal campaign is that sea control changes every 12 hours. Okay, so during the daylight, when we can get our aircraft up in the air, the Japanese can't get within about 250 nautical miles of the place because our planes will attack them. When the sun goes down, the Japanese send in fast destroyer transports and are resupplying the island that way. So it's this bizarre sort of set of, it's mutual siege. Neither side can get as many supplies in as they would like, and sea control changes every 12 hours. Anyway, so we're going to have a grand total of 3 major land battles. One in August at Alligator Creek, which the Americans win. Another one at Edson's Ridge in September, which the Americans win, which is also crucial. And then a third very big one in October, which the Americans win. There's naval battles. There's 2 carrier battles that happen. Battle of Eastern Solomons at the end of August, and the Battle of Santa Cruz in October. And then I would say the most crucial surface battles occur at the very end of the campaign on the nights of 12-13 November. That's the first naval battle of Guadalcanal. And then 2 nights later, on the 14th and 15th, is the second naval battle of Guadalcanal. Even though there have been multiple naval battles all during this time, that's what we historians end up calling them. And I would argue that that second naval battle on the 14th, 15th is probably the decisive naval battle of the whole campaign and decides the campaign in the favor of the Americans. But up until that point, it's super seesaw. The initiative is changing all the time because the Japanese are winning some of these naval battles in the interim. So yeah, it's really unclear up until you get to really December of 1942 who is going to win this campaign.
John, masterfully done. It's almost like you've talked about this before. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Dr. Chris Parry, to bring you in, let's just talk about Henderson Airfield. Why is that so crucial? Why does that matter so much to both sides?
It's critical because you've actually got an aircraft carrier that can't be sunk there. And as long as you can put aviation fuel, supplies and aircraft into it, and you can keep it operational, it can range all the way around these islands here. And as John has already pointed out, attack any shipping, whether it's merchant shipping supplying Guadalcanal from either direction, or indeed warships that are coming in. And as we'll discuss later, the aviation flying from Henderson Field is absolutely critical in keeping the Americans in the fight. Because while the Marines are engaged, and we shouldn't underestimate how well the 1st Marine Division does, it gets reinforcements, both in terms of aircraft, also materiel, artillery, and other troops coming in later. But also the Japanese are trying to get masses of troops in to hold this island. And it's an attritional battle throughout the whole of this 6 months, both by sea, land, and air. And essentially, it's who's going to crack first. And eventually the Japanese do crack because the Americans actually fight very well on land. They keep Henderson Field, and they just about have enough ships at sea to be able to fend off the Japanese, but it's very close.
We're going to start undoing the battle in just a moment, but before we do, let's look at a few key stats relating to both sides. The US and Allies committed around 60,000 troops over the campaign, including over 11,000 Marines. They had a fleet of over 75 ships at their disposal, including 3 carriers and hundreds of aircraft. In total, they lost 7,100 men, 615 aircraft and 29 ships. The Japanese, meanwhile, had around 36,000 men in total. Their fleet was also smaller at around 65 ships and 3 carriers, one being a light carrier. They suffered heavy losses of over 19,000 troops, 683 aircraft and 38 ships. Just before we start undoing the events of Guadalcanal, John, is there anything else you want to mention that's significant in terms of how things actually played out?
Yeah, I do, actually. We need to talk about the climate, which is horrific on this island. It is right near the equator. It rains pretty much daily. And this island is absolutely rife with tropical disease, in particular malaria. But you can also get dengue fever here, dysentery. Disease just lays its inexorable hand on this campaign. Any fresh troops that get put in here within a matter of weeks are, a lot of them, terribly, terribly sick. And so as you say, this attritional engine keeps going here, and a lot of that attrition is being driven by disease. And later for the Japanese, also being driven by starvation, because they can't get sufficient supplies in here to keep the troops that they do land in supply, healthy and fed.
That's a really good point. I mean, you've just come back from there, haven't you? And it's the kind of place where it's so hot and humid and sweaty. I mean, the shirt is sticking to your back.
Yeah, absolutely. You're constantly wet. There are no roads on this island. There's not a paved road to be found here in 1942. So yeah, you're constantly wet. It's muddy all the time underfoot, and trench foot, dysentery, any tropical disease you can think of, you're going to get it here. And it's just a terrible place to make war.
And just one thing to mention, Chris Parry, what's interesting also about Guadalcanal is it's kind of coincidental to Stalingrad.
Yep.
And so you've got the two arguably key turning points of World War II happening concurrently.
Yeah, in different climatic zones as well. You've got winter in Stalingrad, and you've got this horrible situation here. I've got to endorse what John says there. I mean, every description you have is the fact uniforms don't last more than a week. They just rot on you. Your boots don't actually survive. And whenever they capture food from the supplies from the Japanese, they purposely, if they can't take them away, spoil them. They either poison them or urinate on them to make sure that they actually can't use them. And the same is happening on Papua New Guinea at the same time, is people are starving. And the Japanese call Guadalcanal towards the end of the campaign Starvation Island. That's where they're being sent. And then it becomes Death Island, and that's when they pull out at the end. But this is a nasty environment in which to have to operate.
Well, there we go. That's the real history of the Guadalcanal campaign. Let's zoom out now and let's talk about how it could have played out differently. This is History Undone. OK, let's look at how the Guadalcanal campaign may have played out differently. And we're going to do this by looking at some of the key moments in it. We should say, John, you've very kindly given us some brilliant maps that we're going to be showing on screen as we talk about them. Let's start with some of the key points. I mean, the Battle of Savo Island, for example. How could that have played out differently, and why was that so crucial?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Because in my mind, there are sort of three critical junctures throughout this 6-month campaign where the tide might have turned in the favor of the Japanese, and the Battle of Savo Island is the first of those on the night of 8th, 9th August. So the Japanese are completely surprised by our landings, but one guy up in Rabaul, Admiral Mikawa Gunichi, who's the commander of the local naval forces in this neck of the woods, reacts very vigorously and immediately assembles a force of 5 heavy cruisers, a couple light cruisers, and a destroyer, and charges down the slot between Rabaul and Guadalcanal and rolls into what is going to be called Iron Bottom Sound shortly after midnight on the morning of the 9th. He catches the American naval forces there. There's also an Australian cruiser, 2 Australian cruisers, I should mention, that are there as well. Catches our forces by surprise, ends up sinking 4 Allied cruisers, including the Australian Canberra, kills over 1,000 Allied sailors in the course of that action, just absolutely wipes the floor with our naval forces. So there's a critical decision that has to be made here by Mikawa. Does he try to get out of Dodge and make it back up the slot? Because he's concerned that there are American carriers in the neighborhood that may attack his cruisers, after the morning breaks. And he knows what happens to enemy, to Japanese cruisers if they get caught by carriers, because we just saw that at the Battle of the Midway, where the Mikuma was absolutely gutted. He can either get out of town or he can turn around and go after the transport anchorage where the American transports are. And in the end, he makes the decision not to do that. He decides to retreat back up the slot. It is arguable that it would have been worth the price of every ship in his squadron if he could have just sunk those American transports that night. Because if he had done that, he would have cut the entire operation's logistical basis off at the knees, and this campaign might have ended right then and there. Unknown if it would have, but it would have been a terrible blow to American fortunes to lose that logistical base. But what Japanese doctrine tells Mikawa is that if I've won a great sea battle, sea control should automatically devolve to the victor of that battle. And logistics really aren't all that important in sort of the Japanese naval worldview. And he sort of eschews this opportunity and preserves his force instead and gets out of town. So that's a crucial moment, in my opinion. Chris, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. Chris, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, what makes it more important is that the guy commanding this operation, a chap called Robert Gormley, who's down in Noumea, doesn't believe this operation is going to succeed. He actually says that. Yeah. Similarly, Frank Jack Flesher, who's commanding the carrier, says, I don't think this is going to work either. And he's very particular about taking his carriers away in case they get attacked. So Richmond Kelly Turner, who's in charge of the landing operation, and he's the guy who actually says famously, you know, I don't rely on intelligence, I rely on my own intellect. He said that a couple of times, you know, up to this point. He's thinking, well, I'm being left here on my own, you know, to look after this. And to the west of me, I've got a huge battle running. And he does take some of his transports offshore and starts coming to the east. So it seems to me that when you had this disaster, and it is a disaster because you've got 2 American destroyers out to the west, cruising up and down, looking for the threat coming. Yeah. There have been 5 intelligence warnings that these cruisers are on the way, and still they slip through. And to be fair to Richmond Kelly Turner, he says afterwards, the real problem we had at the start of the campaign is we weren't battle-minded. You know, we underestimated the Japanese, and we weren't ready for the intensity, and particularly the ability of the Japanese to fight at night. That's quite interesting because if you go back to before Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel, who gets so much criticism at Pearl Harbor, had been exercising the whole of the Pacific Fleet to operate at night in the same way the Japanese were. The only difference was the Japanese would make mistakes and their COs would survive. The American COs, if they made mistakes, got sacked. So basically, they weren't up to the same level of night fighting with their searchlights. And of course, the other issue that the Japanese have got, which the Americans don't know about at this stage, is the long lance torpedo, which is a very effective torpedo over a long distance, far greater than American surface torpedoes can reach.
Let's talk about another potential turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, John. Why is that so crucial?
So this happens in the middle of September, 12th to 14th September. The Japanese have landed a regiment of troops actually east of the American perimeter over at a place around Coley Point, and they advanced through the jungle. And what they're betting on is that, you know, the American perimeter will not be heavily defended in the south, which is in this, you know, really, really dense jungle just south of the airfield. And so the notion is, we're going to bring this regimental group through the jungle. We're going to attack the southern end of the American perimeter, and we're going to overrun the airfield and end this campaign. And it almost succeeds. There's a 2-day battle that happens on a ridge just to the south of the airfield called Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge for the Colonel Merritt Edson who defended this place. And Edson hangs on by the skin of his teeth. I mean, on the second night, he is pushed back into this tiny little perimeter on the top of this hill. And what makes this so scary is that the headquarters of 1st Marine Division is just at the northern end of that ridge. If the Japanese break through and overrun Edson, they're probably going to overrun 1st Marine Division's HQ and maybe, you know, kill, capture, or scatter the senior officers of that division. And then they're right next to the airfield and they maybe capture that as well. If that happens, the Americans have a supreme crisis on their hand at this point. I mean, they do have another regiment of troops across the water at Tulagi that they could potentially bring in to restore the situation. But if your command and control has been destroyed by the capture of that headquarters, you've got a real problem tactically to restore the situation. The problem for the Japanese general who was in this fight, a guy named Kawaguchi, is that the devilish jungle, as he calls it, makes it so difficult to coordinate the movement of his 3 battalions that during the course of this battle, he never gets more than 2 of these 3 battalions in action at any given time because he just can't coordinate his men. So there was a definite opportunity here for the Japanese. They came within an ace of, you know, kicking us off the top of that ridge, but they just couldn't do it.
That's a fascinating point. So genuinely, that came very close to happening. It could well have been that the Japanese could have defeated the Americans at Edson's Ridge.
Absolutely.
I mean, that could have
Chris,
been
any comments on that
point? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was real touch and go. And you look at the inability to communicate in this very damp environment. The radios weren't working either. So people were having to use their initiative. I mean, it was so significant that I think Edson got a Medal of Honor, John.
Yeah.
He's one of the winners, isn't he? He's absolutely critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
It turns the campaign here. What I think is significant, though, is the doctrine that the Americans had developed for marine fighting ashore in these islands had been developed in the 1930s. So the doctrine was pretty good about how they would actually defend this sort of area. So a beachhead or bridgehead like this was something they were used to. What's astonishing about the Edson Ridge attack and indeed subsequent Japanese attacks is their front on. They don't try any sort of deception. They don't try any sort of flanking attack. They're straight on. And of course, they're straight on to basically canister-fired artillery, machine guns, and everything.
Yeah, well, and I'd actually like to talk about that just briefly, because one of the things that you see in the early war campaigns of the Japanese army in places like Malaya and Burma was that this is a maneuver-based army, and they actually were really good at finding flanks of the enemy and, getting around behind them. The terrain on Guadalcanal is just so awful. Yeah. And the fact that even in places like Malaya, which we call jungle, there's roads aplenty. There's railroads, there's paths, In Guadalcanal, there's nothing, which means that not only is Kawaguchi having real difficulties finding flanks and infiltrating, he also is suffering from a lack of infrastructure. He's not able to use any armor, which the Japanese used in Malaya to good effect. And he doesn't have air cover over his head either, which they also had in these early war campaigns. And so one of the things that I find fascinating is that Japanese army tactics, which had usually been pretty flexible and fluid, become more and more monodimensional just because of the terrain in this island. And they end up doing a lot of frontal attacking. And in the face of American firepower, that is not a winning formula.
Chris?
Yeah, and the other thing is, as John hinted, they're carrying all their logistics with them. They can't establish these bases anywhere on the island. So what you're carrying is your ammunition, your rations, everything. And so they're getting mown down as infantry and nothing else. And you're right, John, no combined arms operation going on. And to be fair, the Marines were into this pretty quickly. And the airfield itself is a major base for logistics. They're operating on internal lines. And the Japanese are going, well, unless we get some sort of external help here, we're not going to be able to do this. Despite the fact the Americans are hanging on to Henderson Field and they're managing to beat off the attacks by land, sea and air from the Japanese, it's not going that well because the logistics supply is pretty infrequent and irregular. They're losing aircraft, both to the local sort of environment and also to the Japanese. They're continuously having to reinforce from Noumea, Espiritu Santo down to the south here. Now, part of the problem is that you have in command a three-star Vice Admiral called Robert Gormley. He's been an ex-presidential aide. He's a staff officer. He has never had senior command, and he's there because nobody else was available at the time to put in that position. And in fact, President Roosevelt says, look, if we don't employ him, he'll have to go down from 3-star to 2-star. Now, what makes things worse is Robert Gormley has appalling teeth. So throughout this campaign, he has toothache. He also has kidney stones. So he's down in Noumea. He hasn't done very well at all in terms of actually establishing any local connections with the French who actually are on the ground there. Everybody from Nimitz downwards is saying, why isn't he commanding at sea? When Frank Jacques Fletcher comes in with the 3 carriers, why isn't he in the carrier group? And so he could have resolved the issue between Richmond Kelly Turner and Fletcher about how long the carriers are going to hang around. But he's not there.
Yep.
And Nimitz says, well, hang on, the King is going, don't we have our people in the front line here actually commanding? But he doesn't go there. He's also got a very weak staff. And eventually what people decide after a number of visits by senior officers, including Hap Arnold, the head of the US Army Air Force, and a number of journalists, Nimitz says to Admiral King, we've really got to replace him. And we've got to replace him with Bill Halsey. And typically, King comes back with a single word, approved. And in the middle of October, Admiral Halsey finds out on his way down to command the carrier group that he's actually going to command the whole theatre here.
Well, that's a good point. John, I'll let you pick up on that. Tell us about Halsey.
Yeah, so Halsey is an interesting character. And I think that, he had his problems later on in the war, but right here, right now, he is absolutely the right guy for this campaign because he's a fighter, absolutely down to his boots. one of the first things that ends up happening is that he flies General Vandegrift, who's the commander of 1st Marine Division, down to his headquarters, Halsey does, and to have a meeting with him and get a sense for, what's going on in this campaign. And one of the things he asks Vandegrift flat out, can you hold on? And Vandegrift says, yes, I can, but I have to get more active support from the Navy than I have been, which to a guy like Halsey is just like, a spear through his heart. It's embarrassing that the Navy is being perceived as not giving its all in support of this campaign. And so Halsey tells Vandegrift, you go on back there and I will give you everything I've got. So his presence, Halsey's presence, I think is like a defibrillator on the heart of this campaign, because very shortly Halsey is putting together a very good command staff. And one of the things he's doing is he's sorting out his logistical problems in Noumea. He's got dozens and dozens of cargo ships that haven't been unloaded because the French are being surly and they don't want us to build warehouses there. Halsey storms ashore, tells the French governor, I'm building, what's going to be 3 million square feet of storage space. I'm taking over this building as my headquarters, and I don't care what the hell you say. And so very quickly he starts, stripping down for action and getting ready to go. And everyone within this theater now believes in the fact that our commander-in-chief in this theater is going to fight down to the last bloody rowboat to hold on to this island.
Now, we talked about some key turning points, or potential turning points, Battle of Savo Island, Battle of Edson's Ridge. Let's come on now, John, to the 2 naval battles of Guadalcanal, because these are hugely significant.
So by the time we get to the middle of November, things for the Japanese are not going great either. They've been trying to bring supplies down at night using fast destroyers, but destroyers are not great supply vessels. You can't put a lot on them. And so what the Japanese say to themselves is, look, what we need to do is put this airfield out of business for a few days so that we can bring down a proper convoy with cargo ships, unload them, bring in fresh troops and a lot of new supplies. What we're going to do is we're going to bring down a bombardment group that's got 2 fast battleships in it, and we're going to basically parade offshore, bombard Henderson Airfield, put it out of business. And they had done this once before in the middle of October. It worked very, very well. So they're going to do a repeat of this exercise. Bring this naval force down, put the airfield out of business, bring our convoy in, land all those supplies, and then we're going to do a final ground offensive against the American perimeter, put this place out of business. The problem for the Americans at this point is both sides' carrier forces, by the time we get to the middle of November, have been beaten to pieces. And we don't have a lot of ships left in the neighborhood to fend off this first bombardment force that comes down. And so, again, Richmond Kelly Turner, whose name we've talked about, is in here with a group of transports unloading supplies when he gets word that this big bombardment force is going to come down on top of him. And he's got a guy in place named Callahan who's going to run this task force. And on the night of the 12th, 13th of November, you get this battle, the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, sometimes called the Battle of Friday the 13th, which is just a complete melee, just a brawl, a short-range brawl, where you have this Japanese force with 2 battleships, a bunch of destroyers, just kind of piles into the American force. And really, within a matter of minutes, you've just got, groups of ships running around. Nobody knows where anybody is. The net result of that, though, is that one of the American cruisers gets very, very close to the flagship of this force that's commanded by a guy named Abe. They managed to put a couple of shells into Abe's flagship, the Hiei, knock its rudders out, and set its superstructure on fire, confuse Admiral Abe, kill his chief of staff, to the point where Abe, within just a few minutes, says, I'm abandoning my bombardment mission. And so this first battle, even though it's incredibly costly to the Americans, that force that we have there is almost wiped out, manages to stave off that bombardment. 2 nights later, Abe is relieved from command. His boss, Admiral Kondo, is going to come back down and try to do this same exercise again with the one surviving battleship, the Kirishima. Halsey now is in terrible, terrible trouble. He's got no operational carriers. he's got nothing left at this point except 2 fast battleships, the South Dakota and the Washington, and this paltry screen of 4 destroyers. And he sends those guys up to Iron Bottom and tells them, hold this place. This is terrifying. Understand, Iron Bottom Sound is about the size of a bathtub if you're a battleship. It's just this teeny tiny little body of water. And maneuvering battleships inside these confined waters with the evident danger of Japanese torpedo attack, it just sends the hair up the back of my neck every time I think about it. But Halsey is determined to hold this place. And so he sends these 2 fast battleships up there. There's a fight that occurs. At one point, the Japanese have knocked out all 4 of our destroyers. They've knocked out the South Dakota, which has problems with its electrical systems. It's down to the battleship Washington versus 13 Japanese warships. Washington destroys the Kirishima with a gunfire duel and manages to, hold the rest of the Japanese ships at bay. And the end result is that when the Japanese try to bring their convoy in the following morning, Henderson Field is still in business, destroys that convoy. And I think in essence, that battle ends up deciding the campaign.
I mean, I think what that illustrates, Chris, is just how many potential turning points there were in the Guadalcanal campaign where things could have played out very, very differently for the Allies.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always see it as a continuous campaign. But in fact, actually, if you sequence it, there are separate campaigns here, each one of which could have gone differently. And there are different branch lines that could have taken it in different directions. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting about the campaign is the lack of impact of submarines. The Imperial Japanese submarines get quite a lot of successes. They sink American carrier. There's an awful place called Torpedo Junction where the carriers really want to avoid. Interestingly, it's where Admiral Gormley wanted them to be stationed, and the carrier captains are saying, we really don't want to go there. The problem for the Americans is, though, even by this stage, their torpedoes aren't working. They've got a serious problem with their torpedoes. If you listen to the oral history by Admiral Nimitz's son, he goes out with a full outload of 24 torpedoes in his submarine. They fire all 24, none of which hit. So they're having a real problem with their torpedoes at this stage from submarines. But one of the things that's interesting, and having looked at it, this is an excellent place for US submarines to operate. But the Americans don't use them. They're well out to the west. And one of the things that surprises me is that the Japanese calculations and decisions aren't complicated, particularly on the way down from Rabaul to here by American submarines. Submarines are there, but because of the torpedo problem, all they're reporting back really is intelligence.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. And of course, the point about the Guadalcanal campaign is it lasts for so long. There are so many individual potential turning points along the way. And we've touched on just a few of them, but hopefully the most significant. Let's zoom out now and let's ask ourselves a really big question. Had the Japanese succeeded at Guadalcanal, how would the rest of the Second World War have played out? OK, we've got our big map of the Pacific theatre of World War II as it would have been in 1942 in front of us now. We can ask some really big what-ifs now. Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you. If the Allies fail at Guadalcanal, what is the impact on the rest of the war?
Well, the fact of life is that if the Japanese are able to take the Eastern Solomons and Guadalcanal here, it means they can then obviously interdict this line between Australia, Pearl Harbor and the West Coast, which is a critical spine for the Pacific campaign, because we're building up combat forces for Douglas MacArthur in the south here, and also we want to go through the central Pacific as well, so it really interdicts it. I have one issue with the distance. That's quite a long supply chain all the way down there. So they're going to struggle to hold on to that. They're going to be vulnerable to American counterattack. That counterattack has to happen pretty quickly, by the way, before they can build up substantial combat power. It also puts the Papua New Guinea campaign in real jeopardy if they take Guadalcanal. And that means if they establish themselves in Papua New Guinea, then Northern Australia becomes vulnerable to, obviously, operations. And you're going to see a repeat of the Coral Sea with the Japanese trying to take Port Moresby and all that sort of thing. So they're extending that line here. And that's what the Americans picked up, the Japanese wanted. They wanted to push out their defensive frontier. They wanted to put pressure on this axis here and also, obviously, put pressure on Pearl Harbor. So that would have been the immediate effect of them taking Guadalcanal. But we shouldn't underestimate how wide they're spread across the rest of the Pacific as well. So the ability to hang on to Guadalcanal and actually extend beyond then, at that stage, I think was quite limited. But there's a lot you can do, as we saw with Henderson Field, with an airfield, and a division that actually means business. Very difficult to dislodge.
John, do you want to pick up on that? Because, I mean, this supply line we keep mentioning between, Hawaii really all the way down to Australia is so important. It's like this kind of sciatic nerve of the Allies. If that gets interrupted, I mean, that has huge consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we look at Australia as being the jumping off point for, operations aimed at the southern perimeter of the Japanese Empire. And so losing it would be a big blow to us. I'd like to, go even big picture and present you with the John Parshall sausage grinder theory of how the world, how this war is going to end.
Go for it. This will be good.
Okay, so, the war has been very episodic for us up until this point. By the time that we get to the Battle of Midway, there's been a couple of naval battles, but there's no place within the Pacific where we're in day-to-day contact with the Japanese. And so the way this war is going to have to end is eventually we're going to have to get our main forces close enough to Japan that we can either bombard them through the air, blockade them into submission, or directly invade them. So we're going to end up having to take places like the Marianas Islands. We cannot do that until we have destroyed the bulk of Japan's military. And so what I say, in this book I've been working on, is that what we need is a sausage grinder to kind of stoke up the attritional machinery and just start grinding Japan's military into kibble. If we lose the Guadalcanal campaign, we've essentially thrown away that sausage grinder, right? And what that means is that the whole course of this war is going to be set back by months and months and months until we can figure out a new location to put a new sausage grinder and start that process up again. So, losing this campaign would, I think, have tremendous knock-on effect in terms of being able to end the war when we historically do end it. If we lose Guadalcanal, we're probably set back by 6 months to a year.
Wow.
John, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, if we lose Guadalcanal, we're back to rainbow plans, aren't we? And it's the Central Pacific that takes precedence. And the Navy's got to work a way out of getting across here. MacArthur's campaign disappears at this point, I think. We can't, if we're under attack here, we're defending. We can't be on the offensive. The one thing that's always occurred to me about this, if I'm doing this at the strategic level, is let's do the reverse of Pearl Harbor. Let's go this route. Let's go through Midway. Let's get Wake back and start actually building up our combat power to attack Japan from here. Because all their combat powers in the Central and South Pacific here, then, okay, let's attack through that route there that they took to attack Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, the only problem with that is there isn't a land base up there worthy of the name. I really come back to the Marianas as the linchpin of this whole thing. Because there we can at least put substantial ground forces ashore and, most critically, of course, base what is going to be the B-29, in 1944. Here in 1942, that plane is still just a pipe dream. It's on the drawing boards, but it hasn't been built yet.
But essentially, if Guadalcanal falls, Admiral King gets his way. You go through Marianas, Formosa.
If King doesn't get fired. I mean, that's the other question. You think about how badly things are going for the Americans in the middle part of this war, with the U-boat war going off the East Coast and all that stuff. If Guadalcanal falls apart, does King keep his job? Does Nimitz keep his job? I really don't know. My crystal ball isn't big enough to make a prognostication on that, but it's a huge mess, obviously, for the Americans.
Can I throw in another counterfactual at you, John? What if the Guadalcanal campaign doesn't happen when it does? Because that was not an inevitability. I mean, you mentioned the planning for it started within days of the Battle of Midway. But, King had to go to London, did he not? And he had a meeting with the British High Command at which they agreed their kind of wider strategy. And basically they modified, as we referred to earlier, the kind of Germany first strategy to being more like a Germany first but. Yeah,
well, okay, and I'd like to modify that slightly to say that, yes, the British end up getting what they want grand strategically, in that they don't have to deal with a cross-channel invasion. We end up going to North Africa instead. But one of the things that's sort of buried in the memo, where General Marshall basically capitulates to the British and says, okay, yeah, we're going to go to North Africa and not do a cross-channel thing, is that there's this little memo down at the bottom that basically says, yeah, we can take a bunch of the aircraft that we thought we were going to use in Britain for supporting this invasion that's now off the books, and we're going to move them into the Pacific instead. And so, yes, the net result is that Admiral King walks out the door with at those meetings. The British don't realize it yet, but Germany first has just been replaced by Germany mostly first. And that does have huge implications for global strategy, not just in the Pacific.
That's fascinating. Dr. Chris Parry, so let's just play some things out then. So we're saying, hypothetically, the Japanese win at Guadalcanal, the Allies are defeated. Do you agree with John Parshall's point that that extends the war in the Pacific?
Oh, yeah. You know, I think we do go to a central Pacific strategy through the Marianas. And the only problem with that is the war the Japanese are prepared for. You know,
right.
Under the old sort of plans, the Japanese were saying, look, we want a trit, to use the American expression, that the American battle fleet as it comes across. And by the time it gets here, our own battle fleet will finish it off. So there's going to have to be a real readjustment. Of course, it's not a battleship fleet anymore. It's a carrier fleet. So I suspect that the Americans will want to build up considerable combat power. Now, the only snag is they've got to get these islands, so the Marines are going to be important with follow-up with the Army. They've got to capture these islands, particularly the Marianas, operating around the Philippine Sea, in order to get these long-range bombers in. And then you've got to say, where are they going to fly from if you're not coming up this way? So there's all sorts of range and logistic challenge associated with that issue. I have to say, that's the same problem the US Navy faces today in relation to China. So how do you get across the Pacific with sufficient combat power to actually affect a victory at the end of it? But the Japanese will be prepared for this. So it's going to extend it, it's going to be bloodier, and the Americans are going to have to build more carriers, they're going to have to build more ships, and they're going to have to train more Marines. Are
we still saying, though, in this scenario, John, that the Allies win in the Pacific, that the Americans do win in the Pacific, or is that in doubt?
No, I am not an economic determinist when it comes to the scope of the entire Second World War. I think that there's a lot of other things that go into play into who's going to win and who's going to lose. But within the context of the Pacific War in particular, the correlation of forces economically is just so lopsidedly in favor of the Americans. And the Americans come into this war with an economy that's 5 times larger than Japan's, and they're going to exit it with an economy that's between 7 and 8 times as large. And so as long as the Americans have got the domestic political willpower to stay in this war, I think we're going to win it. It's just a question of when. And you can get into some nightmare scenarios where you say, well, what happens if the war extends into like 1946? If you posit that the Soviets have already beaten Germany and that they do come into the war against the Japanese, is it possible that they might have invaded Hokkaido and that we would be in a post-war situation like we see in Korea, where there's a North and South Japan, right?
Wow.
So if the war goes any later, you know, you could end up with a situation like that.
Let's play the trump card, the Manhattan Project. You know,
right.
so okay, that's coming on stream. So while this is happening, we've got the Manhattan Project. The only issue you've got is how you're going to deliver it. Because if you haven't got the base to fly the aircraft off, you're not going to get them. You might have to take it to China and fly it from there.
Okay.
So you could do that.
And again, would the timing be different of when the bomb is dropped?
Yeah. Well,
no, it depends on whether we can get the bases to deliver. But no, the Manhattan Project is going to deliver that bomb. I think, Chris, you're absolutely right on the money that raises the possibility that it would have not have been 2 atomic weapons that we used against Japan. It could have been dozens to end this war, which is horrific to think about.
Well, that is quite the note to finish on. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. I think what we've learned today is that, first of all, the Guadalcanal campaign was not an easy victory by any stretch of the imagination for the Allies, and crucially not an inevitable victory. There were certain key turning points in it, from the Battle of Savo to the Battle of Edson's Ridge, and crucially to the 2 naval battles of Guadalcanal. And so had the Japanese won, what difference would that have made? First of all, it would have disrupted the key ally supply line between Hawaii and Australia. It probably would have meant that the entire Pacific approach that the Americans would have had to pursue would have been very different. It may well have extended the war in the Pacific, potentially by 6 months, potentially into 1946. But what wouldn't have changed is the fact that you have the Manhattan Project coming online. The bombs get dropped, but potentially even more bombs that did. So not the two, but as John Parshall just mentioned, you might have had dozens of bombs being dropped on Japan. And potentially Japan could have ended up divided like Korea today with a North and a South. Some really big consequences, all stemming from what happened back in 1942 at Guadalcanal. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to John Parshall and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. That's it from us. Goodbye.